the neighbour who said it was Edna Marsh, and she said it at the Clearwater feed store on a Thursday in September to whoever was within earshot, which included the feed merchant, a hired hand from the Aldrin place, and a man buying rope at the end of the counter who had arrived in Clearwater 3 weeks prior and whom Edna did not know well enough to know she should lower her voice around. Edna was not a malicious woman. She was a woman who talked, which is a different thing, and what she said was that Caroline Reeves was too proud to ask for help and that the Reeves place was going to be in trouble come winter if someone didn't step in, and that she felt for Caroline, she really did. But you couldn't help a woman who wouldn't let you. The feed merchant nodded, in the way he nodded at things that were probably true and not his business. The hired hand from the Aldrin place had somewhere to be. The man at the end of the counter finished buying his rope. His name was Jonah Farr, which Edna Marsh did not know because she had not asked, and he was the man who had bought the Linden parcel 2 properties west of the Reeves place, and he had heard about Caroline Reeves in the way you heard about your neighbours in a new county, which was indirectly and in fragments, and what he had heard was that she ran the Reeves operation well and alone and had done so for 4 years since her husband died, and that she did not ask for help, and that this was said both as a criticism and an admiration depending on who was saying it. He paid for his rope and drove back to the Linden parcel and thought about what Edna Marsh had said, and about what he knew about the Reeves operation from the road, which was that it was well-managed land in the middle of a season that was harder than average, and that the labour situation on a single operator farm in September was not a situation that left room for anything going wrong. He had come to the Clearwater Valley from a county north of the ridge because the Linden parcel had been the right land at the right price, and because he had been looking for a place to point himself for long enough that he had developed a clear idea of what the right land felt like when he drove past it. He had driven past the Reeves property 8 times in 3 weeks and had been reading it the same way he read all land, which was for what it said about the person managing it. And what the Reeves property said was that someone was paying close attention and doing the right thing in the right order and had been doing it alone. He thought about this and drove past the Reeves gate on his way home and noted the state of the hay in the near field, which had not been cut yet and which needed to be cut before the weather turned, and he went home and thought about it for the rest of the evening and decided what he was going to do in the morning, which was the same thing he would do about any problem he could see a solution to. Caroline Reeves was 35 years old and had been running the Reeves property since her husband Daniel had died of a sudden thing in the spring 4 years ago, and she had run it with the particular competence of a woman who had been working the land alongside a man for 8 years and had understood every part of the operation before she was managing all of it alone. The Reeves property was 160 acres in the Clearwater Valley, good land, well set, with a hay operation and cattle and a small grain section in the west field that she had added 2 seasons ago because the market had said to. She had a hired man for 3 days a week in the busy seasons and 1 day a week in the quiet ones, and the rest of the days were hers, and she managed them accurately. She was not proud in the way Edna Marsh meant it. She was private, which was not the same thing, and she had learned in 4 years of running the place alone that asking for help in a small valley produced obligations and commentary in roughly equal measure, and she had decided that both of those things cost more than they were worth. She got up early and went to bed late and knew what she was doing, and the land showed it. She was at the east boundary fence on a Friday morning in September when the truck came up the county road and slowed at her gate and turned in. She did not know the truck. She kept her hands on the fence wire and watched it come up the lane and stop without hurrying the watching, because she was a woman who did not hurry assessments when she could help it. The man who got out was the one from the Linden parcel, which she had heard had sold in August to someone from the North County. She had not met him. He had the look of someone who had been working land a long time, which was a particular kind of look that she recognized because she had it herself. And he came to the fence with the unhurried manner of a man who had decided what he was going to say and was now saying it. And nothing about the saying required her to make it easier for him. He said good morning. She said good morning. He said his name was Jonah Farr, and he had the parcel to the west. She said she had heard. He said, I heard in town yesterday that your hay hasn't been cut. She looked at the east fence wire. She said, I've been working through the priority list. He said, the weather is coming in from the north end of the valley. She knew that. He said, I have a cutter and a day. She looked at him. She said, I didn't ask for help. He said, I know. He said, good thing I didn't wait to be asked, because the weather is going to be here before the week is out, and the hay is going to be caught on the wrong side of it if we don't move. She looked at the north end of the valley, which had the quality of sky that she had been watching for 3 days and which was saying what he was saying. She said, you cut hay before. He said he had been cutting hay since he was 12. She said, I pay the going rate. He said, bring me lunch. She looked at him for a moment. She said, the cutter's in the barn. He said he had his own. He went back to the truck and she stood at the fence and watched him drive around to the east field, and then she went to see about lunch. He cut hay all day. She did the morning's other work, and at noon she brought out the lunch pail, and he stopped the cutter and sat on the running board and ate without making anything of the eating, and they talked about the Clearwater Valley weather patterns and about the Westfield grain she had added, and about the north boundary fence, which was the shared fence between the Reeves property and the Linden parcel, and which she said had been needing attention since July. He said he had seen that from his side. She said she had been planning to get to it in October. He said he would do his half before October if she wanted to coordinate. She said that was fair. He ate the last of the lunch and handed back the pail and said the east field would be done before sundown. She said she would start the turning in the morning. He said, good. He got back on the cutter, and she went back to her work, and the afternoon went about itself. And by sundown the east field was cut, and he loaded the cutter and drove out, and she watched him go from the barn door, and then went in and made supper. She heard about the conversation at the feed store from the hired man on Tuesday, who mentioned it the way people mentioned things they were uncertain whether to mention, which was carefully and with apology available. She said, what did he say after? The hired man said Jonah Farr hadn't said much. He said the man who sold rope had asked who owned the property with the uncut hay, and Jonah had said it was his neighbor and that he was going over in the morning, and that had been the end of the conversation at the counter. She put the account book down. She said, what did Edna Marsh say? The hired man said Edna had already left. She picked up the account book. She thought about this in the evening and found that she was thinking about it more than she had intended to, which was itself a piece of information. She did not examine it directly. She went back to the accounts. He came by the following week about the north boundary fence, which they had agreed to coordinate, and they walked the shared fence line together, and she showed him where the posts had heaved, and he showed her where the wire had gone on his side, and they agreed on a work date and on materials, and they shook hands on it, which was the kind of handshake that meant what it said. She had been watching him while they walked the fence, the way you watch a person you are still taking the measure of. He walked the fence the way she walked it, which was reading it rather than looking at it, noting the condition of each section and the cause of each problem. He did not tell her what was wrong with her sections. He said what he saw and waited to hear what she thought. She said what she thought, and he added what he knew from his side, and they arrived at a plan that was more complete than either half would have been. That was the second thing she noted. After the fence discussion, he said he had noticed she ran the grain section on a tight rotation for the field size, and asked if she had been losing yield at the margins. She said she had been managing it. He said there was a variety from the Eastern Territory that had been bred for the soil type in the valley and that ran tighter without the margin loss, and that he had a contact for seed if she was interested. She said she was. He said he would send the contact information. She looked at him. She said, "How did you know about the tight rotation?" He said he had seen the field from the county road and had been reading it since August the way you read a neighboring field when you are trying to understand the land you have moved next to. She said, "Most people would have asked about my yields directly." He said he had not wanted to be presumptuous about it. She looked at the west field. She said, "And the question about the margins?" He said, "That's not a presumptuous question, that's a useful one." She did not disagree. He drove out, and the fence line was behind them, and the afternoon was going cold toward the west, and she stood at the property line and looked at the west field and thought about tight rotations and Eastern Territory varieties and a man who had been reading her operation from the road for 3 weeks and had arrived at the right question. The contact information arrived in the mail on a Thursday in a plain envelope with no letter inside, just a business card and a name circled in pencil, which was the most direct form of the thing she had been watching him demonstrate. She wrote to the seed contact and ordered what she needed, and put the business card in the desk drawer where she kept useful information. The first frost came in October and the hay was in, and the north fence was right, and the west field had been overseeded with the new variety. And she stood at the edge of the west field in the October cold and looked at the ground and thought about next spring, which was the right thing to think about in October, and she thought about the year that was ending and the year ahead, and she allowed herself to notice that the year ahead looked different from the previous 3. Not because it was easier, but because there was someone on the adjacent parcel who had cut hay without being asked and had not made it into a debt. A woman named Patrice Weld came to the Reeves house on a Wednesday in November with a covered dish and the organized concern of a woman who has decided her intervention is warranted. She said she had heard that Caroline had been spending time with the new man at the Linden parcel and that she hoped Caroline was being careful and that a woman in Caroline's position needed to think about appearances and about what the community expected. She said she was saying this as a friend. Caroline put the kettle on. She said she had walked a shared fence line with her neighbor once and that he had helped her cut hay before the weather came in, which was a neighborly thing in a farming valley, and which she would do for any of her neighbors who needed it. Patrice said, "Some people are reading it as more than that." Caroline said she would let the people know if there was more to read. Patrice looked at the kitchen. She said, "Daniel would want you to be happy." Caroline poured the tea. She said, "I know what Daniel would want." She said it without making it into anything, and Patrice, who was not a stupid woman, understood the shape of the conversation and drank her tea and left. Caroline washed the cups and looked at the west field through the window and said nothing to the window, because there was nothing to say to a window, but she thought about what Patrice had said, which was that Daniel would want her to be happy, and she thought about Daniel and about the 4 years since, which had been 4 years of managing correctly and with discipline and without allowing herself to want things she was not certain were available, and she thought about whether that discipline had been a protection or a habit that had outlasted the reason for it. She looked at the west field and the grain on it that was going to come in differently next year because of a seed contact on a business card in her desk drawer. She thought about this for a while. The west field said what it said, which was that the work was right and the land was responding, and she went back to the accounts. It was a Saturday in November when it shifted. She had been mending harness at the workbench in the barn, and he had come by to return a gate latch he had borrowed to replace one on his own fence, and he had stayed because the harness took 2 hands at a certain point, and he had offered the second pair, and she had accepted, and they had worked through the afternoon on the harness and talked about the winter ahead and about the grain variety, and about a water question on the north section that she had been thinking about since October. He asked the question she had not been asked in 4 years, which was what she had been thinking about for the winter, not what she needed done, not what was on her priority list, but what she had been thinking about. The question arrived the way he delivered everything, directly and without ornament, and she received it the same way. She did not deflect it or make it smaller by saying she hadn't thought about much, which was the social answer and which would have been false. She set down the awl and thought about it honestly. She said she had been thinking about whether to add a small greenhouse on the south side of the barn, that the season in the valley was short and the extension would let her start plants 3 weeks early, which would change what she could grow and would change the cost structure of the kitchen garden and would also make the winters feel less closed in, which was a thing she had not said to anyone, but which was accurate. He said he had been thinking the same thing about the Linden parcel, and the way he said it, not as agreement, but as information, told her he had been thinking about it independently and had arrived at the same place from the same reasoning. She said, "You haven't built it." He said, "I haven't." She said, "What stopped you?" He said, "I didn't want to build it alone and then have it be the wrong design for the site." He looked at her. He said, "I would be glad of a second opinion." She looked at the harness in her hands. She said, "I'd have to see the south side of your barn." He said, "Come Saturday." She came on Saturday and they walked the south side of his barn, and she said where the greenhouse would do best and why. And he listened with the full attention he gave everything, and the November light was thin and specific on the south barn wall. And when she was done, he said, "That's what I thought too." She looked at the barn wall and then at him and said, "Then you didn't need a second opinion." He said, "I needed to know if we were thinking the same way." The November afternoon was cold and still, and neither of them was in any hurry, and what had been building since September was in the barnyard with them, and they both knew it was there. He said, "I have something to say, and I'm going to say it plainly." She said, "All right." He said he had come to the Clearwater Valley in August and had found the land was right, and the valley was right, and the neighbor to the east was the kind of person he had been looking for without knowing he was looking. He said, "I went to your fence line in September because the hay needed to be cut, and I had the means to cut it." He said, "I came back because I wanted to." He said, "I am asking to keep coming back, permanently, as your husband, if you would want that." She looked at the south barn wall where the greenhouse would go. She looked at him. She thought about a man who had cut hay without being asked and had not made it into an obligation, and who had asked what she was thinking about rather than what she needed done, and who had said he hadn't wanted to build the greenhouse alone and then have it be the wrong design, and who had said he needed to know if they were thinking the same way, which was the most honest account she had been given of what a person wanted from her in 4 years. She said yes. That was what she wanted. He took her hands and held them, and she let him, and the November cold was around them, and the barn wall said where the greenhouse would go, and neither of them had to figure out the right thing by themselves anymore. They married in February in the Clearwater church, and the valley came because the valley came to things, and Edna Marsh was there, which was right because Edna had not been wrong in September. She had simply been talking to the wrong person and not known it. The greenhouse went up on the south side of the Linden barn in March, exactly where Caroline had said it would do best. It came in on schedule and ran the way a properly sited greenhouse ran, which was efficiently and without drama, and the starts went in 3 weeks early, and the season extended the way she had planned for it to extend. And she stood in the greenhouse in the early spring light with the cold still on the world outside, and the warmth inside exactly what she had calculated it would be, and she thought about 4 years of accurate calculation and what it had produced, and about a man who had come along and found the calculation worth standing beside. The north fence between the Reeves property and the Linden parcel had been mended jointly and was sound. The east field hay was in and correct. The west field grain variety was running without margin loss. Jonah had started calling the combined operations by a single name, which had first been a convenience and had become a fact. On a morning in the second spring, she was at the workbench, and he came into the barn with coffee and set it beside her without asking if she wanted it, which she had not needed to be asked because he had learned in the winter months, where the asking was unnecessary and where it was required, and he had sorted the categories accurately, which was the most complete form of being known she had been offered, and which she was still arriving at the full understanding of. She picked up the cup and kept working, and he sat on the old stool that had been Daniel's and read the seed catalogue she had left open at the page she was considering. And the sitting on that stool was not a thing she had arranged or required him to acknowledge, and he had not acknowledged it, which was the right response. And he sat on it the way people sat on useful things, which was without drama. He said, "The winter variety on page 43 has a better cold tolerance for this valley." She said, "I saw that." He said, "And?" She said, "I'm considering it." He said, "Fair enough." He turned the page. She kept working. The coffee was warm and the barn was the barn, and the second spring was doing what second springs did when the first year had gone well, which was arrive with less to prove and more to build on, and she was building on it, and so was he, and the greenhouse was full of starts that were going in 3 weeks earlier than the valley had started them in any previous year on either property, and that was the shape of things now, and it was sufficient and more than sufficient, and she had figured this out without asking anyone. And that was the story of Caroline, who was too proud to ask for help and found someone who understood that the help wasn't the point. The seeing was. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this one. Thank you.